Good morning. If you have your Bibles, turn to 2 Timothy chapter 1. We're going to look at verses 5 through 7 here in just a moment. What a wonderful song the choir sang. We remember all the great things that you have done. A song of praise, a song of worship to the Lord. So I want to start with a question. Do you remember specifically some time when God was doing great things in your life? We would say when God was really close to you or you were really close to Him. A time when your faith was strong. What's interesting, if you ask that question and you give you some time to think about it, so many people think of their strongest points in faith or of the faith in the past. It's as if we're saying we only remember the things that you have done, the great things you have done in the past, and not in the present. So think on those things. What is it that you recall, the great things that God has done in your life and in those around you? When we think like this, we have thoughts like, I remember when God worked in amazing ways. I remember when God changed my life. I remember when God was so amazingly faithful. But sadly, those thoughts are often followed up by thoughts like this. Where is He now? Why isn't He working? When will He change my circumstances? And on and on and on. Now, my argument to you today, and you'll see this from Paul as he's writing this letter to Timothy, in 2 Timothy, is that our faith has been stolen in some ways by the weapon of fear. Our faith has been stolen by the weapon of fear. The enemy uses fear to rob us of our faith, which in turn robs us of our hope and our joy. So what is fear? What is fear? Fear is an emotion caused by the belief that someone or something is dangerous. There's danger ahead. Fear. I'm scared. I'm nervous. I'm timid. I'm shy. I'm not going to step out in faith because of this emotion that rises up because of a belief that something or someone is dangerous. But let's contrast that with faith. Faith, and a true faith that we'll be talking about today, is a total dependence on God that becomes supernatural in its working. Now I want you to see something before we dive into the passage here. Both fear and faith involve belief. Both fear and faith involve belief. Fear is belief in the visible, the things that we can see. Maybe out of our control, but the things that we can see. Faith, a true faith, is belief in the invisible, the God that we cannot see. Fear is the belief that the harm that might come to me physically is so bad and so terrible and so outrageous that it prevents me from seeing God work through me by faith in Him. So I have this contrast here between a fearful life or a fear-filled life. It is a belief. It's a belief in the visible. It's a belief in the physical. I can see things, but they scare me. Contrasted with this faith that's a total dependence on the unseen God. So what is true faith? Let's talk about that just a little more before we read the passage. Hebrews 11:6 says, without faith it is impossible to please God. Nothing else counts if faith is missing. Nothing else counts if faith is missing. There's no other foundation for Christian living, no matter the amount of self-effort or energy spent. There's no other foundation for the Christian to live by apart from faith. We must have faith in the Creator, in God. And furthermore, nothing else touches or reaches to the Father and to His heart as much as when His children simply trust Him, and we do it wholeheartedly. Wholehearted trust in God. Now here's the key for today, and this is what Paul is addressing here in this passage. When does the enemy attack? When does the enemy attack with this fear that brings about this belief that everything's out of control, I'm losing out on everything, the world's falling apart? When does the enemy attack? It's at the point when God is calling you to a deeper faith. It's at those point Maybe if we're thinking in the past when you were living faithfully and God was showing up all the time, great things were happening, and then God comes in and says, I'd like you to take this deeper or further step of faith with me. That's when the enemy shows up, and he says something like this. Just like the first question in the book of Genesis, did God really say that? Did God really tell you that you need to share your faith at work? Did God really tell you that you need to sign up for that mission trip? Did God really tell you that you need to parent your children differently? It goes on and on and on. Did God really say these things? And it's at those points of struggle, hardship, when faith is about to grow that the enemy steps in and says, did God really say? And what he's doing at this point, he's misdirecting our faith from God to self and to the trouble that might come upon us. He's misdirecting our faith from God to ourself. Did God really say? Oh, I don't know. Maybe that's just me telling myself I want to do that. Maybe that's just some desire I have. And we begin struggling in the mind with this doubt that's planted there because of the question of the enemy. And he misdirects our faith onto ourselves. He misdirects our faith from the invisible to the visible. Now, Paul here in 2 Timothy is going to write to Timothy to prepare him for times of trouble just like this. The times when faith is tested, the times when faith has the opportunity to grow, the times when the enemy steps in and tries to convince you that you shouldn't change, that you shouldn't step forward, that you shouldn't follow God in faith. Let's read the passage, just 3 verses here, 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 5, 6, and 7. You can follow along, and I'll read them. Verse 5, for I am mindful of the sincere faith within you, which first dwelt in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and I am sure that it is in you as well. And for this reason I remind you to kindle afresh the gift of God, which is in you through the laying on of my hands. And then verse 7 will be the key verse of the day. For God has not given us a spirit of timidity or a spirit of fear, but of power and love and self-discipline or self-control. So if the enemy uses this tactic of fear to get us off track and get our faith focused on other things than God, then how do we fight back? How do we push back against the attacks that he brings on us and to us and toward us? Paul lays it out here in verse 5, 6, and 7. Verse 5, he says, look for and remember evidence of sincere faith. In verse 5, he says, I've seen it in your grandmother, I've seen it in your mother, and I know that this faith is present in you. So, point 1, look for and remember evidence of sincere faith. The enemy's attacks often involve the seed of doubt. That didn't really happen, did it? That didn't really happen, did it? The seeds of doubt grow into fear because we come to believe that maybe God didn't do anything. Maybe that was just a circumstance. Maybe that was just a coincidence. Maybe that just was an action that someone else chose to do at a random time. And so the enemy steps in and begins to say, I don't know if God really did that. So what Paul is saying here, what he's saying to Timothy is when these times come, don't forget about what God has done. There's evidence of God working and acting in your life in the past. Don't forget about those things. In fact, tell those things to the enemy. God is faithful. He was faithful then and he's still faithful today. God worked then, he's still working now. Maybe you don't see it, but fight back with the truth of what God has done. It's evidence of God's work in your life. It's evidence of God's action in your life. Remind the enemy that God has worked and is still working in your life. Remember the things that God has done in the physical that came from the invisible that he worked through you in. Those things that you talk about. Now, I said earlier, some people, that's the only story they have is when God worked in the past. We don't want to get stuck there. We don't want to get stuck only in the past because God is alive and well and continuously working day in and day out. God is continuously working should we choose to join him in that work. Should we choose to step past fear, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But in order to get there, in order to get to that relationship, or in order to get to that walk with Him, we must remember all that God has done and tell others about that. I remember a time for myself. I've shared the story with you before, so no details, but when I surrendered to the ministry, the Lord had been working on me for many years. That's sad to say, right? The Lord had been working on me for many years. And the enemy came in and he said, just think of everything you're going to have to give up. Just think of everything you're going to have to give up if you choose to do this, if you make this decision. But what was so interesting about that point when I surrendered is in our bedroom, everyone was gone, it was just me, and I was reading through 1 Kings for some reason. I don't know why that's significant, but I was reading through that, and I just knew that God was calling me to something different, something more. And I got on my knees in that room and just said, God, take it. Take my life and use it how you will and how you choose. And it was almost like in that moment, there was a vacuum, and I don't say this lightly, there was like a vacuum of the miraculous that began to take place. Just something happened when I surrendered all to Him that God began to work in some amazing ways. I've told the story probably 100 times, but I'll tell it. Like we sold a house that we had just built in a town of 200 people. We sold it in 1 week's time. Like, it was just amazing. Put a sign in the yard. A guy called us that night and said, I want that house. I said, really? You want a house in this town? We had a contract the next week and sold it 2 weeks after that. And then when we moved, my wife needed a job because I was going to be in seminary. She got a job at a first interview at a school that she sent a random resume to. It was just amazing. And the stories, I could go on and on and on. But if I get stuck there at what God did, then I'm going to be stuck now. I can't just remember those things. God did work, yes, and He did some amazing things, and I want to tell you all about them when we have time. But I also want to be able to tell you what God did today. What's God doing in my life today? What's God doing in your life today? How is He working through you? And so often, it's an unwillingness to surrender to God daily that prevents Him, and I said a vacuum of the miraculous, but prevents the spiritual from coming and channeling through or working through the physical, through us. And so that drives us into the next point that he makes here, that Paul makes to Timothy in verse number 6. He says, and for this reason I remind you to rekindle or kindle afresh the gift of God. So the remembering of God working in the past is a spark. There's a fire there. It's a small spark, but I'm telling you about it. It was going, and he's saying, okay, there's a spark there. Now let's rekindle what was happening in the past. Let's kindle afresh the gift of God, which is already in you. Let's rekindle this gift, which is inside you. We've got to talk about, what is this gift? If he's saying kindle afresh or ignite this fire of the gift, what is the gift? A little Greek for you. Gift, the word charismata or charisma. We get the word charisma from it. So the word is derived from charis, which is C-H-A-R-I-S, charis, which means grace. Charis means grace. When you add M-A on the end, and it makes the word charisma, it literally means for us the result of grace. The charisma, the joy, the Spirit working through me is the result of grace working in my life. It's the result of grace working in your life. As we reignite this fire of our faith, we must lean into God, the invisible, and away from the visible. Now, the point here on the gift or the charisma or this gifting of grace, don't seek the result of grace, but seek grace itself. Don't seek the result, but seek the one who gives grace, God. And here's what happens. Fear focuses us on the physical. Fear convinces you of all the things you can't control, which are true. I can't control other people. I can't control the weather. I can't control others' actions. I can't control what others say. I have no control over those things. And no wonder we want to hide in a hole when we're scared, right? If we believe all those things and that's the only way we live by, no wonder we live in fear. No wonder we hide out. But as we reignite this fire, it's a leaning away from only the things that I can see, into the God who I can't see. Because I want that grace. I want the evidence of grace. I want that charisma. I want that gift to flow through me and to work through me and to be evident in my life. The demonstration of this gift or of grace is not to be activated by the individual, but by the grace giver, God himself. He's not going to manifest this gift in our lives when we're trying to live on our own power and authority. He's not going to manifest it when we're trying to live on our own power and our own authority. The gifts work in such a way that they're not permanent. See that in 1 Corinthians 12:7. But they're opportunities for God to make himself known. Why? Why would I say the gifting isn't something that's permanently on you as a gift of prophecy or a gift of faith or a gift of love? Because if it was in that way where I could just manifest it at any point in time, then it would become almost like a superpower for myself and a point of pride. So the way that God works through us is through surrender to him. And so when we look around and we say questions like, I remember when, or we say statements like, I remember when God worked back then, but he's not working now, you have to ask, am I completely surrendered to him right now? Not, I will surrender to him tomorrow or next week or next month, but am I surrendered to him right now? If there's no evidence, if there's no charisma, if there's no evidence of God's work in your life, you have to ask that question, am I surrendered to him? In the situation, in the circumstance, am I trusting him? So often fear pushes us the other way. I only trust the things I can see, the things I can control, as much as I think I can control them. So the question now becomes, how do we overcome fear? Or how we overcome fear, we must be channels for God to work in and through us. I got to say that again. To overcome fear, we must become channels for God to work in and through us. Daily surrender. So how does that happen? The same way you received grace. At some point in your past, hopefully you've come to this place where you've given your life to Christ, you've been born again, you come to that place, heard his voice, he was speaking to you, he was calling out to you, say, come get this gift of salvation. How did you receive that gift? Total surrender to him. You surrendered. You said, I trust you with my life. True faith, a bold faith. And so that's what we're talking about here. If we want to be rekindled afresh with this gift of God, it's not of us, it's of God, then we've got to be totally surrendered to him right now. This drives us to faith in the invisible God. This drives us more deeply into a trust in him. Now, in this room right now, you may be aware of it or you may not. In this room right now, there's this stuff, I don't know what we call it, if it's a thing called Wi-Fi. It's all around us in this room right now. You go to businesses now, it's there. You go to restaurants, it's there. Wi-Fi. Now, I don't know about you, but I can't see it. I can't touch it. I can't hear it. But I do know it's there. I do know it's there. I mean, so if you think about it, it's so amazing that literally all the information that humanity knows is floating around in this room. Height of the Eiffel Tower, I can find it. Sorry, that was my fault. No napping, I got the weapon now. I just know to slap my hip. It's like on the holster. What was I saying? Oh, Eiffel Tower, yeah. It's all around us. That information is available there. You need to know how to plug in the heater on your block of your diesel motor, which apparently my dad had never used when he sold me the truck. I had to look on YouTube last night to find how to do that. But it was there, amazingly enough. All this information is there, and yet we have no access to it. I can't reach up and pull out information. I can't just grab it. I have to tune into it in some way. And you guys know those ways, through some type of device, some type of electronic device, a laptop, a cell phone, a tablet, all those things. You have to literally get on there and push a button that says, I'm tuning into this frequency. I'm tuning in to this frequency. You have to push that button that says, I want that. I want to know how tall the Eiffel Tower is. I don't know why that always comes up. Like, I don't know. Why is that a question? We should just all memorize it so we'll know. But all that information is available to us. Should we tune into that? And hopefully you can see the point. The invisible that we can't see becomes connected to the visible and becomes meaningful, becomes useful, becomes valuable as it's manifested in our lives. Same is true. There is so much available to you and I as followers of Christ in the unseen. Things that we may not even understand. I have no clue how Wi-Fi works. Couldn't tell you. I just pushed the button. There's so much available to you and I in our faith that God has given to you and made available to you. Should we push the button of our faith and tune in? Should we trust Him? Should we choose to listen? Should we choose to obey? So I challenge you today to push that button of your faith. Today, tune in. When you need information, you don't wait and say, I'll look it up later. You get the device out and you tune it in. We need God today working in our life. I remember when, but I want to remember when today He was working and I saw Him. That leads us to our next point, point number 3, and this is verse 7. God has not given us a spirit of timidity, a spirit of fear, but a spirit of power, love, and self-control. Now I want to make a statement to you, and if you want to write it down, it would be good to have. If fear dominates your life, then you are tuned into and listening to the wrong spirit. If fear dominates your life, then you're tuned into and listening to the wrong spirit. Verse 7, God has not given us a spirit of timidity, a spirit of fear. The spirit of fear is not of the Lord. Honestly, this is why I don't watch network news or read a lot of news. It's become acceptable to use fear as a form of persuasion. Like I can remember in college, I was a poli-sci major. I don't know why, but I was. And we would spend all our days and our evenings watching all the major news networks. And I came to believe that the world was literally going to end because of the news that we saw every day. And I realized, and I don't think I'd connected it until I was looking at this week, but I realized that spirit of fear is used to convince us of things and to take actions that we may not ordinarily take. Now, there's not the only place that there's this spirit of fear, but I ask myself the question, why would I want to submit to something that uses a spirit that's not of the Lord to convince me to take actions that obviously may or may not be of the Lord at some point? Now, you can come up with 100 other circumstances or situations where there's a spirit of fear used to persuade, but Paul says to Timothy, God doesn't use those spirits. God doesn't use a fear tactic to convince you to do something, to make you take an action. So if He doesn't use fear, what tactics does He use? And furthermore, if the enemy is fighting you and I with this tactic of fear, how can we take back our faith? Are we given any weapons to fight back with? And the answer is yes, and he lays them out with these last 3 little points in verse number 7. Our weapons are not the spirit of fear, but the spirit of what? Power, love, and discipline. We take back our faith through the spirit of power, love, and discipline. As we live in surrender to the Lord, then these things work in us and through us. Now, qualify some statements here. These items or these weapons are not self-created, but God created. I say weapon, I don't mean points of control or superiority, but of total surrender. These are opportunities for us to surrender to the Lord, and then He works through us through power, love, self-control. Let's look at those 3 really quick like. Power. This is not a power that means I go and I overtake others. This is a power of, better to say it, it's the opposite of cowardice. It's a boldness that comes from the Lord. It's the ability to step out in faith when He calls you to those points of stepping out. Have you ever had a time, just as an example, maybe you needed to have a difficult conversation with someone? You knew it was going to be hard, but you needed to have that conversation in order to bring about healing. You knew you needed to have the conversation to fix something, right? You needed to do that. What happened? The enemy stepped in, said, no, they're going to think less of you. They might make fun of you. They might not agree with you. There might not be any, whatever. It goes on and on and on. These things might happen. What might happen if I have this conversation? The enemy steps in so you hide, but this is a power. It's a boldness to be faithful to God, even in difficult conversations, situations, and circumstances. But then he doesn't just leave us with this boldness to step out. He gives us this weapon. It's funny, I shouldn't call it a weapon. This ability to love. The spirit of love. This is agape love. This is affection or benevolence. Think about times when you've been scared or had fear brought about by the enemy. He convinced you that everything was going to fall apart, so you had to keep everything for yourself. He convinces you that it's only about you. So what do? You keep everything close to you. Keep your time, your resources, all those things together. You're not willing to give them away. That's a spirit of fear. I'm scared. I've got to have these things because if everything goes apart tomorrow, at least I'll have something for myself. But the spirit of love is completely opposite of that. It's a spirit of benevolence or of giving. Faith says, give it away. Give it away because God has got my back. God will step in and fill the void that you've given from. He fills that for you. I don't know how to say this. I've succumbed to this fear before, over the last couple of years even, where the enemy convinced me of some things that were not true. He convinced me, you don't have any friends. You don't matter. The things you say aren't worthwhile. He convinced me, the list goes on and on and on. But all these things that weren't true. But what I realized in those times was I was unwilling to give my time to anyone else. When you're scared and you think you don't matter, you don't want to give it to anyone else either. But what I should have been doing, and I learned this now, is fighting back with this love that is empowered by God through us. The willingness to give time, resources, love, attention, affection, all those things, the willingness to give and not just keep and guard. That's a spirit of fear, but God gives us a spirit of love. And then last of all, He gives us a spirit of discipline or self-control. The idea here is He makes us sober-minded, having the mind's desires and passions in control. Having your mind under control. Now, when fear is present, the mind gets out of control because we begin to realize all the things that we can't control. I talked about this earlier. The enemy steps in, he convinces you that you don't matter, things aren't working out. He makes you scared, so you take your faith off of God, you begin focusing on yourself and those around you. You begin to realize, I can't control that person. I can't control what they say. I can't control what they do. I have no control. So panic sets in. Panic sets in because you realize I can't control these things, and it brings about a certain level of madness. I can't control these things. And so what this is showing us, when we surrender to God, He sets our mind in order because our minds are no longer focused on everything that we can't control, but we're focused on the one who is in control. We're no longer focused on all the things we can't control, but we're focused on the one who is in control. And that's where we rest. That's where we place our faith and our hope. I can't control anyone else, but I can control the actions that I take. I can control the words that I say. I can control the things that I do. I can control the time that I spend with the Lord in prayer, seeking Him, in His Word, seeking Him, and allowing Him, giving Him the opportunity to work through me. Giving Him the opportunity to work through me. If you'll turn over to the Old Testament book of 1 Samuel chapter 30, there's a really short story I want to wrap up with. David was on the run from Saul. He had basically given up all his opportunities or all the places to hide in Israel. He took himself, his 600 men, and their wives and children to a place called Ziklag. That's fun to say. And they were hiding there. And here's the story, and I want to show you one point in verse 7, but I'm going to read the first 6 verses. Then it happened when David and his men came to Ziklag on the 3rd day that the Amalekites had made a raid on the Negev and on Ziklag and had overthrown Ziklag and burned it with fire. And they took captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great, without killing anyone, and carried them off and went their way. And when David and his men came to the city, behold, it was burned with fire, and their wives and their sons and their daughters had been taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him lifted their voices and wept until there was no strength in them to weep. Now David's 2 wives had been taken captive, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail the widow of Nabal the Carmelite. Moreover, David was greatly distressed because the people spoke of stoning him, for all the people were embittered. David and his men had been raided, and everything they valued had been taken from them. At that point, the people were about to stone David. He was consumed with fear. What do I do now? Everything's been taken from me. The end of verse 7. End of verse 6. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. In the Lord his God, David strengthened himself. So many of us approach faith in this way. I got to do better. I got to strengthen myself. But David, in this story, strengthened himself by driving into seeking the Lord in a moment of trial, hardship, where he lost everything. If you're here this morning and the story of your faith only involves the past, only involves something that happened back then I want to challenge you with this idea that maybe at some point God called you to something deeper and you said no because fear, the enemy, came in, and then he's actually robbed you of your faith or the ability to daily have faith in the Lord. Now, I want to challenge you with this action. This is what David did. Strengthen yourself in the Lord. Whatever your circumstance, whatever your situation, whatever your trial, strengthen yourself in the Lord. Not tomorrow. I mean, it sounds like a good idea. Like, yeah, I might do that sometime. I might try that if nothing else works. No, I'm saying strengthen yourself in the Lord. The story there with David, he goes to the Lord and he says, can I go take back everything that you've given to me? Can I go take everything that's been taken from me? Can I go take it back? And the Lord said yes. And he goes and he delivers the enemy to David and his men, and he brings back everyone. No one was harmed. No one was put to death. They lost nothing. Are you willing to call out to God and say, can I get everything back? Can I get my faith at least back to where it was, but I actually want to go deeper than that in the future? Is that something you're willing to do this morning? I leave you with that challenge. Strengthen yourself in the Lord. We're going to have a few moments of invitation. Some music will play, and we will sing together, and we'll give you the opportunity. If you need to be strengthened in the Lord, how do you do that? I told you several times throughout the message, it's complete surrender to Him. It's opposite of what we think. We think, oh, I got to do more. I got to strengthen myself. But the path is surrender to Him. And in those moments, when you surrender to Him, it enables Him to work through you and live through you like you've never seen before.